Oh, hey, heads up, there will be some late game and final boss spoilers for the DLC in this, so proceed at your own risk. Ladies, gentlemen, and tarnished of all ages, there's a lot of busted, broken, silly things in Elden Ring, and that is no different with the DLC hitting and adding a whole lot of new things to actually break. One of the most classically powerful things in the game is bleed buildup. It does percent damage to enemies when it procs, meaning that it scales with the difficulty of your enemy being better against healthier foes. And importantly, if you manage it correctly, you can use it to skip a normal phase skip point by thousands of damage, over damaging an enemy past when they would normally move phases, and making the enemy who normally has a much tougher secondary phase simply get to spend less of their time alive in the tougher phase, making the fight easier as a whole in its entirely own unique way. Bleed is special, and while there are some bosses that are resistant or even immune to it for good reason, there are surprisingly few of those in the DLC. And while there was a recent small balance patch aimed at fixing some of the buggier interactions, not too much of that was aimed at the silliness that is bleed. So today we're going to talk about the 3 most busted bleed builds new to Shadow of the Erdtree, with the extra layer of just having a look and a check-in with them post-patch and seeing if any rankings have changed at all between them. I'll be going from worst to best in my own opinion, and these will be relatively pure bleed builds in the best of ways, meaning that the main damage of the build either comes from bleeds themselves, or it is entirely based around a weapon set on bleed affinity. In third place then, we have pretty much any colossal sword that is set to bleed affinity while using the new spinning gravity thrust Ash of War from Commander Gaius. All ashable colossal swords will hit the same amount of bleed buildup on bleed affinity, it's just the way they work. Same with specifically Gaius's sword lance heavy thrusting sword, but of these, the weapon with the highest AR, while in an appropriate setup, is the classic Guts greatsword that everyone loves. The trick here is, of course, relatively simple. Spinning gravity thrust is a ton of small weapon hits in a row, but unlike most fast-hitting weapon skills, every tick of damage counts as being hit by the weapon itself, meaning that it applies status buildup and builds up the multi-hit successive hit bonus talismans and the effects too. This creates a really simple but beautiful synergy where you stack bleed buildup on the weapon, hit 45 arcane for the soft cap of bleed scaling, put on successive hit bonuses, and anything that buffs you after triggering a bleed, and then you've got some absolute magic going. Not to mention this Ash of War has ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous amounts of poise. Like, as close to infinite poise as you can really get in the game. Even the final boss won't knock you out of this attack, which means that you can trade when you need to, and you can always guarantee as a result that you will get massive bonuses from the multi-hit effects, even making sure that you can guarantee that you'll do both inputs for the double spin without getting knocked out of it, as long as you're, willing to sacrifice some health for doing so, making this just incredibly powerful overall, with the only real negative being that you do have to actually trade damage to get it off against a lot of the bosses, which can be a little bit tricky. Second place today then is probably one of the most prevalent builds popping up in the DLC, which is Bloodfiend's arm, set to bleed scaling and then abusing the unique heavy attack and the way that it double stacks bleed buildup. Before the patch, this was a lot more arguably tied for number 1, if not even just fully number 1. It was pretty consistently 1 charged heavy attack per bleed proc. Now it is 2, sometimes more like 1.5 because of any carryover if the bleed triggers in the middle of the hits connecting. The bleed buildup though on this is definitely lower than it was before the patch by a decent amount, but it still hits ridiculously high amounts of bleed buildup, and it's still far from the realm of balanced if you know how to set it up properly. And you can do that with either Endure, which would let you tank a hit and trade to do the heavy, or Royal Knight's Resolve whenever you get the opening for 1 giant meaty charged attack. The main deal with this one then is the weapon itself just hits for massive numbers. The amount of bleed buildup that you get is insane, and because the best way to apply the bleed is charged heavy attacks, you can then further synergize it with a ton of other things like the two-handed talisman, the charged attack boost. There's just a ton of synergy available that makes this thing hit like an absolute truck, not to mention when you get the bleed proc, activate all your other buffs, and you're still doing charged heavy attacks, which are your best way of applying bleed, but also just your best way of doing damage as a whole. Not to mention, also, there's nothing stopping you from using this with like a shield if you really wanted to, just to make it even more defensive on top of its ridiculous offensive power. First up then, the most powerful bleed build in the game is simply impenetrable thorns, the sorcery. This was pretty much up there at the top before the patch, undoubtedly, and the patch didn't really touch this spell in the slightest, honestly. What makes this spell insane is that it fires out 3 lines-ish of bleed-applying thorns, but they apply damage along the way of their path, and if you have a target selected, and if that target is relatively close to you, every single bit of thorns from the attack will hit them, and each one applies its own separate little bit of bleed buildup. This is by far the most inconsistent one on the list. Sometimes it will go funky on the targeting and only do like 200 to 300 damage. Sometimes it will go directly through an enemy without even connecting with them in the first place, but other times it will go nuts and hit for like 13,000 or more out of absolutely nowhere, getting like a double bleed proc or something like that somehow from a single input. You can, of course, push this further by using an arcane scaling staff purposefully, like the brand new maternal staff, which has great arcane scaling. Pop your arcane stat up to 45, which is the hard cap for magic bleed arcane scaling from staves, then use things like Terra Magica to actually boost your magic damage after you're standing in it, Lord of Blood's Exaltation and White Mass to boost the raw damage itself of the thorns hitting so that it can do even more damage on top of the bleed itself too every time that you proc a bleed, and you can even use something like the Rakshasa armor set in the rest of your slots just for the general damage boost that gives you, along with, you know, a little bit of poison, a little bit of damage negation. And this specifically is just a really boostable thing. There's a surprising amount of things that you can use to synergize and boost the raw damage itself of the thorns, even under the bleed. And that said, you still have room for things like a defensive talisman or two in the setup to still do ridiculous damage if you really want to. And then if you pair this with the new insane levels of bleed buildup that this spell already has, it leads to this just hitting absolutely insane levels of power. The amount of damage you can do in a single use of this skill. Of course, you could argue it is harder to manage than either of the previous builds. It is definitely harder to get these off than it is in the first build, unless you do things like using Endure on a dagger in your main hand while having the staff in your offhand, and that can do a lot of good for you, but then you're once again back to trading for damage. This thing just happens to trade a lot more efficiently, as the amount of damage that you have to take during an Endure is much less than the entirety of a spinning gravity thrust. I do think it's undeniable, no matter how you look at it, that the raw power of this specific build, when things line up, just tips in favor of this build over the other two, especially after this patch, and it honestly is probably just the most powerful bleed build in the entire game, if not the most powerful build in general, to be completely clear about that. That just about does it for today then, everyone. Just a discussion and overview of the most powerful bleed builds new in Shadow of the Erdtree, and how things have settled with these since the first balance patch that affected any of these things. Of course, the main target of the patch was perfume bottles, you could probably tell, rip my tiny little aesthetically pleasing friends, but bleed has remained surprisingly barely affected by all of this. Even though they did at least try a little bit of rebalancing for Bloodfiend's arm, it just hasn't done much to stop it. I hope you've all enjoyed this then, just checking out how these are all doing, and I hope you enjoy using any of these yourself if you do choose to do so. Like if you liked the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.